Chapter 1. Seeds of Change. The first farmer circa 10,000 before Common Era to circa 8,900 before Common Era, the long twilight at the end of the Ice Age. Between about 10,000 before Common Era and 8,000 before Common Era, large bands of humans across the fertile river valleys began to diverge from the older rhythm of roaming foragers. They experimented by harvesting wild grains such as einkorn, barley, and emmer, saving handfuls of the plumpest kernels for sowing after winter. Gradually, these simple second reap cycles solidified into early agriculture, planting the first seeds of what would become settled villages. At first, the fields were small, scattered patches around familiar oses or spring rims. The groups that stayed behind tended their seedlings, used sharpened flint sickles to cut stalks, and ground seeds in stone bowls, transforming the rhythm of life from seasonal drift to steady cultivation. As the same families returned each year, refuse and stone tools accumulated near their hearths, creating the distinct signature of early dwellings. Within a few centuries, by circa 9,100 to 8,900 before Common Era, the earliest clustered villages appear, sometimes 400 to 600 people living in mat-walled or mud brick homes, built in tight circles, or rows along fresh irrigation ditches or terraces, in places called Jericho and Ohalo II. These settlements began to include looming wall foundations, communal storage pits sunk into floors, and shared ovens. Bodies were interred beneath domestic floors in simple stone-lined vaults, tying family history to place, but also spreading anxiety over crop spoilage or ritual taboos. As more seed varieties were planted and herds offered goats, sheep, pigs, perhaps cattle, the resonance of new problems emerged. Diets rich in cereals but poor in variety caused malnutrition, tooth decay, and stunted growth in children, especially during lean years. Close cohabitation with livestock and stored grain led to parasite infestations and respiratory illnesses, with many women burying more than one child beneath the same floor as morning dawned anew. By roughly 9,000 before Common Era, tangible social divisions had crystallized. Some dwellings feature caches of groundstone tools, decorative pigments, and multiple storage jars, while others contain none. Skeletal evidence shows repetitive stress markers in bones, hinting that some individuals performed heavy digging or grinding, while others did not, planting the seeds of early inequality where fertile land or craft skill translated into prestige or control. Ritual began to accompany harvest and sowing. In open squares between homes, small altars of red ochre, ground seed offering bowls, and quietly recited confessions of who took the fattest grain became part of seasonal cycles. "It rains when you hoard," whispered one neighbor after a poor year. "You did not pour the barley offering," admonished another before the spring rains broke. Such gossip shaped alliances and rivalries, and could determine whether a village gathered for a feast or fell into grain quarrel. At the very end of circa 10,000 before Common Era, 1900 before Common Era, the first signs of organized cooperation at greater scale emerged. Villagers collectively hauled timber or stone to build low wall foundations, sometimes 1.5 to 2 meters thick, around core clusters, perhaps as a symbol of unity, territory, or only seasonal culvert control. These tasks required authority figures, elders or ritual leaders, who could call families together for labor, sustenance, and seasonal decision-making. By the close of this first epoch, the world had pivoted. Nomadic foragers transformed into seed sowers, scattered huts grew into villages, and casual campfires became earth-thick hearths beneath clay tile floors. Tensions coalesced into traditions. Ritual, gossip, craft, and conflict wove the fragile social fabric that would carry humanity through millennia. Chapter 2. Towers, Temples, and Ritual Power. Circa 8,900 before Common Era to circa 8,100 before Common Era. In the centuries between circa 8,900 before Common Era and 8,100 before Common Era, the fragile wave of Neolithic settlement surged greater than scattered huts. It erupted into monumental architecture, sustained rituals and power networks built in stone and memory. Towns that had once clung to stream courses now gathered beneath the gaze of stone towers and circular sanctuaries. Together, they reshaped meaning, shifting allegiance from clans to collective identity. Stone as structure, stone as stake around circa 8,300 before Common Era. The settlement near Jericho. Tel Eshjalton tributes the first massive stone tower ever built, over 8 meter high with 20 internal steps, surrounded by a defensive-looking wall, nearly 4 meter high and nearly 2 meter thick. It was not built in fear of war. Rather, this opulent rampart and towering cylinder of dressed limestone stood behind the wall, as if taunting any approach, casting shadows at midsummer solstice across the huts below. That calculated alignment made the tower less of an embracer and more of a spectacle, a crafted invitation to abide by communal order, share in seasonal grain tasks, and affirm who belonged inside the wall and who didn't. This was communal labor organized at scale. Hundreds of people, working for months, binding villages into rituals of stone laying and mortar smearing, marking permanence in the land and star. The tower became a pulpit for seasonal declarations. The sowing must proceed in unity. The seed store must be accounted. Outsiders might stand outside the gate. Göbekli Tepe, ceremonial circles without ritual houses further north in Anatolia. Centuries earlier, but with lasting resonance, Göbekli Tepe emerged between circa 9,600 and 8,200 before Common Era as a place where hunter-gatherers assembled, not to sow or settle, but to build. Enormous limestone circles, some 30 meters across, stood crowned by cavernous tiki-shaped pillars, carved with lions, vultures, snakes, and abstract glyphs. Central lines of 2 pillars dominated each enclosure, forming silent witnesses to gatherings that may have drawn together participants from dozens of clans or regions. These megalithic temples appeared before agriculture took root in surrounding valleys, built on bedrock plateaus with carved cisterns and spoil corridors, alongside temporary structures. Gourds and grinding stones cluster at excavation levels, evidence of festival feasting and ritual subsistence built around seasonal abundance or astronomical sightlines. Every few centuries, enclosures were intentionally buried, filled with earth until floors and pillars disappeared. Then new circles were erected above them. To a living building, such entombment may have signaled renewal. Old alignments retired, new alliances made, previous myths rewritten. Ritual power in the village crowd with these monumental sites as horizons. Smaller villages mirrored a similar ethos in humble ways. Seasonal rituals in communal squares echoed reverence and negotiation. At the solstice, villagers poured grain at the foundation stones of newly built reed halls, or the clumsy remains of earthen embankments near pattern fields, or reenacted silent drama depositing cattle bones in painted shells and pits while elders recited coded oaths. Gossip surrounded these events. Do you remember how Maroom hid the bull's thigh at the east enclosure? They say the wailing at dawn was still heard beyond. Ritual masks of red pigment were worn only by seers chosen through lineage. One woman, pretending to be the vulture spirit, prowled the central yard, and villagers said harvest doubled that year, or so the rumor claimed. Authority, surveillance, and shared labor between roughly 8,300 and 8,100 before Common Era. Sites such as Göbekli Tepe and Jericho imposed social protocols. You contributed grain, labor, and presence, or risked losing place. Elders or ritual masters mediated this order. During feast weeks, absences were noted. During fire rituals, names of clans were remembered, and those absent might awaken to silent smiles. Likewise, ritual leadership emerged through the ability to summon shared labor, building a pillar, stacking reed bundles, smearing plaster onto a wall. Cooperation between villages, coordinated pilgrimages to temples, wove the earliest social networks. When a clan withheld food, rumors circulated. They sent no flame to the temple fire. They mocked its smoke, implying spiritual fault and communal retribution. Shared work created shared debt. One season's labor obliging next season's harvest. Trust became currency, and public orgies of labor served as calendars too. Stone blocks for TT pillars, plaster layers for enclosures, walls to claim territory and meaning, gossip and power plays. Who counts the grain? Walls and temples weren't just stones. They were ballot boxes in a silent election. Who measured grain ration? Who guarded entrance paths to the tower? Who carried the red ochre from hamlet to temple? Rumors flew at feast tables. The man who trimmed the laurel pillars took more bronze blades in return than any elder. Someone whispered, after the wall fell, mysteriously. The fire priest said, "Let the wind bury it all." And the clay seeds failed. If you fold your path south of the tower at dawn, your name is sweet in elders' mouths. Every rumor pricked community awareness and served to keep the pulse of authority alive. Chapter 3. Plastered Ancestors and Community Memory. Circa 8,500 before Common Era to circa 6,500 before Common Era. From around 8,500 before Common Era through 6,500 before Common Era, the Neolithic world deepened its roots into belief, memory, and lineage. As villages dotted river valleys, a powerful new practice took hold. Plastered human skulls, ceremonial relics molded from actual ancestors, that anchored household identity, social rank, and sacred tradition. Amid these artful memorials, neighbors found meaning, rivals whispered rumors, and the texture of ritual life wove ever more tightly into village conflict. Skulls breathing life into lineage during this 2-millennium span. Human remains, especially skulls of esteemed clans, were carefully exhumed months or even years after burial. The organic corpse matter was removed, and the empty skull cavity was filled with lime plaster. Artisans reconstructed facial features, painted them with ochre red, fashioned shell or stone eyes, and displayed them in houses or small shrines. These 3D ancestral masks were not simply effigies. They were meant to suggest presence, breathing ancestral counsel or intimidation into the household. Each plastered skull served as fixed memory of a founding ancestor, a silent overseer present at feasts, boundaries negotiations, or grain distributions. When villagers argued over who had sown more seed, or who would carry the fire across winter thresholds, the ghostly painted face watched. Gossip spread. They buried the father twice, forgot his mask, or it touched her skull. They said, "Hissed at me." Such tales shaped behavior and shaped land claims. Your place by the hearth existed so long as your ancestor's visage watched from its shelf. Kinship, mobility, and married alliance. Meanwhile, villages expanded and formed stronger kinship networks across fields. Archaeological traces indicate that many of the remolded skulls belonged to individuals born far from the settlement, suggesting exogamy, where women moved into new villages upon marriage. In contrast, males tended to reside in their birthplace, inheritance, and land, staying within a patrilocal system. This arrangement sustained both connection and competition. A woman entering her husband's house brought alliances and seeds, yet also invited suspicion. Rumors like, "She talks to her skull in her birth dress," or "Her people still claim our fields." The plastered skulls thus became tools of social memory, serving as lineage anchors amid mobile social bonds. When drought or disease struck, families placed the skull in public view, poured grain before its pedestal, and recited rival clan names aloud. If the harvest failed, whispered accusations followed. They did not build the mask high enough. He lied about that shell eye. The seer said the final stroke of paint cracked the skull's power. Household sanctuaries and ritual thresholds. Households centered around these skulls became quasi-sanctified spaces. Mud-plastered niches where offerings of grain, pigments, incense, or ivory figurines were made. When new dwellings were constructed, the ancestral mask might be moved to the hearth alcove, with walls painted in ochre bands, signaling both protection and a claim to territory. Location of the skull in the room mattered. Near the door to ward off enemies during feast nights. At windowsills to bless opening to air and sound. On certain feast days, a group of houses would form a mask circle outside. A ritual gathering in which neighbors whispered confessions of theft or pagan envy to ancestral faces in turn. The oldest among them spoke through the skull. a ceremonial seer chosen by lineage, who directed futures nightly in exchange for barley. When fireplaces cracked as dusk crept, villagers walked in procession before lamps, touching plaster and tasting dreams of rain. Feasting, faction, and fragmentation feasts became holy occasions with ceremonial display. The masked ancestor would be placed atop reed mats. Grains, pulses, and goat's milk were offered. Dancers circled while masks swayed in the torchlight. These feasts served multiple fates: cohesion, competition, and clandestine politicking. Alliances were formed. Villages exchanged not only food but marriages. Rival clans haggled over who contributed more grain. Seers murmured predictions through the plaster mouth, sanctioned by the specter above, yet they also bred gossip. Rival houses told stories. They opened the skull on feast night. We saw shell eyes flicker, or he tickled the nose of the painted skull. The clique laughed, but the seed rotted. Some feasts spiraled into accusations of sabotage. Grain spills blamed on touching the wrong mask, or lunacy confessions performed by women accused of mocking their elder ancestors. Memory and power in stone and bony as the centuries passed. The tradition of plastered skulls waned in some regions, especially where ceramic wares and communal architecture took over. But until circa 6500 before Common Era, these relics remained the primary visible nexus of household legacy. They were far more than art. They were law, lineage, and warning. When dispute arose over inherited land, an unadorned mask might be reburied in silence. That gesture was as damning as a curse whispered over barley thresholds. Younger plants grew over abandoned masks. Villages shifted or merged. New houses rose on old hearths. Yet fragments of plaster, slight ochre brush, strokes on pots or walls, persisted, suggesting the ancestral gesture survived in painted iconography, lineage figurines, or mask-shaped deposit vessels, even after actual skulls disappeared. Problems people faced and cultural transformations in these layered centuries, communities wrestled with. Nutritional strain. Continuing dependence on cereals created seasonal famines. Mask-owning families might hoard or share grain selectively, making skulls symbols not only of protection but of scarcity politics. Disease transmission. Dwellings with skull shrines did not mitigate overcrowding. Diseases such as gastrointestinal parasites spread through stored food pits. The plaster masks themselves, confined in niches, could foster mold and smell, becoming contested spaces. Social friction. As alliances shifted, masks changed hands. Power transfers happened through controlled inheritance of these relics, sparking rumors of swaps, thefts, or even faked skulls sold to rising clans. Still, from these problems came cultural innovations. Artistry of lime mixing, pigment selection, shell inlay techniques, and standardized facial modeling. The lineage mask became a prototype for later carved anthropomorphic figures or clay busts in Bronze Age zones. Chapter 4. Women by the hearth, men at the ox, labor and inequality in Neolithic villages, circa 8200 before Common Era to circa 6000 before Common Era. In the time frame stretching from roughly 8200 before Common Era to 6000 before Common Era to 6000 before Common Era, the Neolithic world entered a new rhythm. Villages expanded, fields multiplied, and specialized tasks solidified roles. Across Anatolia and into Central Europe, women, men, and children forged distinct daily worlds. Women spent long hours grinding grain and preparing hides. Men tilted into clearing timber, digging terraces, or stoking communal ovens. This period saw the emergence of early hierarchy, not complete caste systems, but precursors carved by labor, material control, and inherited advantages. 1. Labor intensity and the female body. Neolithic women's shoulders, wrists, and kneecaps show extraordinary strength. Measurements of archaeological skeletons reveal upper limb bone thickness, around 11–16% greater than that of modern elite rowers, while lower limb strength aligns with mobile lifestyles. These bodies told a story of repetitive kneeling and bridging querns over coarse saddle stones for hours day after day, grinding cereals into flour and processing animal hides, round after round. Such ridged arms, tied to seated toil, remained visible even in Bronze Age survivors, showing unwavering resilience, but also deep wear in adulthood. 2. Male domains and axes of prestige. In contrast, male skeletons more commonly bore indications of joint wear in shoulders and spines, evidence of heavy cutting, timber hefting, or tilling. Some males were buried clutching stone adzes, tools used to carve beams for house frames or dig reproductive trenches for planting. These items appear as grave goods only in some burials, about 15–20%, and those individuals had strontium signatures tied to less rich valleys, suggesting they belonged to families with inherited lands of fine soil. Other men lacking tools or status signs likely lived on less fertile hills. 3. Gendered grave goods and task expectations. Analysis of over 400 stone tools recovered in Neolithic cemeteries shows that male biological burials often included implements showing use wear from woodwork, hunting, and butchering, while female-associated burials included tools worn from hide scraping and plant processing. As farming spread west, this pattern persisted, hinting at cultural reproduction of gendered labor and expectations from household economies to broader communal identity. 4. Settlements on the edge. Health and dietary strain. At early sites like Ashukli Hoyuk, one of the first farming settlements, skeletal remains show that most women died around age 25, while men commonly reached their 50s. Female remains also carried more spinal and knee deformities from long kneeling, suggesting that routine female tasks, grain grinding, food preparation, were physically harsher than many male fields. Overall, infant mortality hovered above 40% in some seasons, burdening women as both caregivers and ritual mourning custodians. 5. Early inequality by inheritance and land access. While most Neolithic societies did not host rigid hierarchy, some households stood apart. Studies across early LBK, linear band ceramic communities in Europe found that men buried with adzes came predominantly from less variable, less geologies, pointing to inherited access to prime arable land. Women, in contrast, showed higher mobility. Isotopic analyses indicate they often originated from off-fertile zones, migrating into families, sometimes via patrilocal marriage, suggesting households were defined both by land and lineage, not egalitarian stewardship. 6. Specialists, spinners, and the rise of skill within settled villages. Craft specialization grew. Some women mastered fiber production, weaving nets, baskets, or cloth. Others learned pigment preparation for skull shrine rituals or pottery decoration. Men who oversaw timber shaping or communal labor, such as constructing enclosures, earned respect not by inherited land but by control of tool sets and guild knowledge. These specialized skills sometimes transferred to daughters born into artisan families, reinforcing a growing social map of labor-based social lines. 7. Public ritual as redistribution. Event when droughts or crop failure ground grain stones to dust. Villages gathered for ritual redistribution. The masked ancestor skulls, tower built by elders, or open squares beneath storage pits, hosted feasts where rare grain was shared or reabsorbed. These events required labor, baskets of barley carried by women, carts of veal by men, firewood stacking for ovens. Participation was not just about farming but a public stage where giving and withholding revealed wealth, and those who showed up kept their place in seasonal debts and alliances. 8. Seasonal cycles and the labor calendar. From sowing to wax, these communities followed year-long chore patterns. Spring field clearing, early summer harvest, late summer drying, autumn feasts, and winter repair. Women cooked daily porridge, collected pulses, mended textiles, and stored seeds, while men leveled terraces, tracked trade caravans, or reinforced palisades. Children walked behind both, watching, learning, and eventually inheriting tasks. Labor divisions may have looked flexible from the outside, but by adolescence, each child knew their lane. Gendered lineage work. Chapter 5. Trade, obsidian, and early exchanges. Circa 7000 before Common Era to circa 5500. Before Common Era, between circa 7000. Before Common Era and 5500. Before Common Era. Neolithic communities shifted from isolated villages into ever larger network of exchange. Stone, shell, and salt became carriers of value. Obsidian blades gleamed beyond local fields. Luxury goods reached distant feasting circles. Trade, once a whisper, now shaped local prestige, inter-community tension, and even ritual identity. 1. Black glass, sharp edges. Obsidian mirrors and blades in central Anatolia, around 7,000 to 6,000 before Common Era. The volcanic highland near Nenezi Da supplied a rich obsidian source. At Tepekik, Shift Lake, craftsmen developed production techniques to cut, polish, and shape this black glass into round reflective discs. Obsidian mirrors. These objects were few in number but high in symbolic value. They were carefully modeled, shaped through multiple polish stages, and sealed inside reed-aligned clay bundles. Many ended up in non-local settlements, marking early prestige exchange cycles. Meanwhile, at Ashikli Hoyuk, occupied circa 8,200 to 7,400 before Common Era, domestic workshops produced long-blade tools and spearheads from obsidian. Chemical analysis suggests these blades were traded as far as the Levant and Mesopotamia, while incoming exotic goods, shells, pigments, salt moved in return. This reciprocal flow foregrounded obsidian as the Neolithic era's first global trade item. Historians interpret these obsidian discs not as utilitarian mirrors, but as ritual prestige objects, used during seasonal ceremonies, ancestor worship, or marriage alliances. They became tokens of kinship and indebtedness. Owning one meant you had ties beyond your ridge. Sea routes and island sources of obsidian trade also flourished across the Aegean Sea. By circa 7,000 before Common Era, inhabitants of Frankthi Cave in Greece were acquiring obsidian from the island of Melos, some 200-300 kilometers away, via early sea crossings. As farming spread west into Europe, these Melian cores were carried inland, engraved, and traded among linear band ceramic groups far from the coast. In western Anatolia, at sites like Shukarichi Hoyuk, archaeologists uncovered obsidian blades whose chemical signature matches Melos, far removed from local volcanic sources. These blades, toys for hunting or symbolic axes, are interpreted as evidence of maritime exchange and technology diffusion. Boats, once seasonal fishing crafts, became trade vessels. Fisher traders carried obsidian to inland hubs, pocketing spondylus shells or salt in return. These voyages fostered new rituals. Sets of blades and shell beads exchanged during young women's initiation or elder negotiations over land. 3. Shell wealth. Spondylus and prestige currency. B. Circa 5,500 before Common Era, golden purple spondylus shells from the Aegean began appearing in cemeteries across Europe, from Bulgaria to Poland and France. Strung as bracelets, belt pendants, and beaded headdresses, they traveled over 1,000 kilometers, matching patterns of early agricultural spread. Their rhythmic diffusion coincided with the arrival of copper at the edges of Neolithic circles. These shells held deep religious meaning, possibly tied to fertility or water cults, yet they also served as proto-currency. Beneath burial tumuli of elite couples, ornaments made of spondylus and polished obsidian blades signaled status linked not to land, but to trade alliances. Even in purely agrarian settlements, you'd hear whispers. Their belt glowed like sea, so they owned the river's worth. A man without a single shell might have no voice in communal harvest feasts. 4. Problems across exchange routes as trade expanded, so did social friction. Resource envy. Villages near obsidian sources dominated tool production. Rival communities whispered that only those with claimed birthrights could access the glass, turning earlier gossip into open tension. Trade secrecy. A seer's son might hide a mirror under the hearth, refusing to share. Rumor brewed that his fields failed the next year due to ancestral curse. Spoilage and fraud. Shells were woven into cheap imitations, or old blades repolished as new gifts. When a mirror cracked unexpectedly, neighbors accused the glass knife maker of magic theft, debt, and ritual obligation. Trade goods created obligations. A village that refused to reciprocate after receiving obsidian could find itself excluded from seasonal ceremonies. Gossip spread. They got shells for grain but returned a skull mask. 5. 5. Cultural innovations and legacy trade in obsidian and shell led to standardized crafting. Mirror workshops refined multi-stage polishing. Blade tools followed pressure flaking styles. Spondylus beads were crafted into specific shapes, indicating specialized artisans. Early trading guilds. Neighborhood collectives began to pool obsidian, salts, and copper minerals, hiring telescopic canoe crews to cross seas. Proto-merchants who ranked not by land, but by craft. Symbolic economy. Goods became memory vessels. Exchange ceremonies at obelisk enclosures or lineage feast pits cemented alliances. Trading patterns foreshadowed notions of tribute and ritual taxation. Proto-metallurgy seeds. Near the end of this epoch, copper nuggets began to enter exchange cycles alongside shells and obsidian, setting the stage for the Copper Age. From circa 5,500 before Common Era onwards, rumor and ritual. Trade as social script. Trade opened new channels for rumor. They sent a mirror to the desert peoples. They seek bronze blades now. The shell necklace returned after winter. It smelled of sea foam even in summer. At dawn, they hid flame under the mirror, proof they trade with stranger spirits. Small markets by seasonal river crossings became pressure points. Elders monitored goods loaded. Seers blessed departing crews. When obsidian supply delayed, villages blamed drought. When shells arrived early, purveyors recited thankful pledges to aquatic ancestors. Trade was not passive. It reshaped seasons, measured debts, and redefined power. Chapter 6. Pottery. Weaving and early household crafts. Circa 6,800 before Common Era to circa 5,500 before Common Era. At the watershed years from circa 6,800 before Common Era to circa 5,500 before Common Era, Neolithic villages unfurled a new layer of everyday life. Domestic crafts became as essential as fields or feasts. Clay vessels, woven cloth baskets, and decorated tools joined seed and bone in the rhythm of household survival. These innovations did more than ease daily chores. They spawned new roles, rivalries, and rumors spun into the community fabric. The rise of pottery, clay as kitchen and identity. Around 6,800 before Common Era, rudimentary pottery, hand-shaped clay vessels, began to appear in small numbers across the Near East and Anatolia. These early jars had thick walls and rough surfaces, but they offered a big advantage: durable storage. Through the centuries that followed, closer to 6,500 to 6,000 before Common Era, pottery became widespread. Villages everywhere added troughs, bowls, and smoking jars to their hearth circles. By circa 6,000 before Common Era, regional styles emerged. Pale, mineral-tempered ware in the Levant, dark burnished pots in eastern Anatolia, and incised or painted patterns in Mesopotamian Neolithic settlements. Charcoal-etched motifs and twisted string impressions became common decoration, sometimes telling where potters trembled their cords in spring ritual. As pottery grew, so did skill and hierarchy. Households rich in ceramic storage could save more grain. Some even buried pottery beneath floors or behind communal hearths as stores and symbols of status. Weaving, spinners' whorls, and the soft revolution almost at the same time that pottery spread. From circa 70 to 60 before Common Era, weaving textiles emerged across villages. The earliest evidence comes from impressions on clay or plaster in Jarmo, Tilul, Iathalalat, and Saddlehoyuk. These impressions hinted at plain weave baskets or looms. Soon, spindle whorls and loom weights became standard finds, especially in central Anatolia by 6,600 to 6,200 before Common Era, signaling widespread yarn production. Weaving was mainly women's domain. Nets, mats, cordage, baskets, and eventually linen strips, wool or goat hair fiber cloth. By circa 6,000 before Common Era, weaving technology had matured enough to create heirloom textiles, patterned cloths, colored wraps, ritual sashes. These became linked to lineage, marriage rites, and seasonal ceremonies. 3. Household craft guilds and early specialization. Pottery and weaving sparked new roles in village labor. Artisans. Some households became pottery hubs, firing bowls by open pits, practicing temper ratios, and polishing vessels for feasts. Others specialized in thread, cordage, or basket weaving, mastering plant fibers like nettle, rushes, reeds, or hemp. Trade began to distinguish craft units. Pottery styles from one region were traded for spun yarns or shell beads. Markets grew along seasonal paths. Knotted gourd straps or shell-decorated pottery passed through seasonal river crossings. Some villages gained reputations. The jar makers, the weavers of fine braided cords, or the mask ribbon cloth people. Specialization also amplified division. Households that made surplus tools or vessels stored more grain and often married better. Artisans counted not just time, but galaxies of social capital. For practical problems and ritual traps, these innovations were powerful but risky. Fragile goods. A dropped pot destroyed half the year's vegetables. Shards sparked gossip. The pot cracked when she stirred at the feast. Her grain is cursed. Broken vessels sometimes became ritual pieces rather than thrown away, but still carried superstition. Material limits. Woven mats rotted in damp cellars. Soaps or pest infestations destroyed stored cord. Weaving mistakes in burial textile wrappers became examples of bad fortune, debt, and secrecy. Craft goods provoked jealousy. When two villages traded jars for a bolt of cloth, the loser was rumored to have slept under the wrong roof, meaning she'd leaked technique. Trades became seasonal risks. Some women wove secret patterns. Others hid platters under granary benches to prevent crop diviners from seeing clan insignia. Social control. In some villages, the cloth weaver's apron stripes could only be worn at harvest feasts. Misuse could lead to shaming. Don't come under my tower wearing red fringe unless you made it with elder seed. 5. Culture, gossip, and ritual and crafts were woven into ritual. Some potters carved motifs of grain palms or ancestor skull silhouettes on pot handles. Weavers arrayed sash strips in ritual halls at solstice feasts. Cord braid ornaments and basketry circles served as initial markers for initiates or new brides entering families. With these visual codes came talk. They mixed old clay with sand so their jar could hold more grain. She braided with nettle from her mother's field. They say it holds heat of last spring's drought. His spindle whorl is carved with goat's horn. Only he may spin on feast day, or his timber flecks blood. These whispers shaped trust, access to seeds, bestowal of craft apprenticeships, or who could officiate ritual weaving. Women wove not just cloth but social ties. Potters shaped more than jars. They molded communal memory. 6. The legacy of domestic innovation. Be circa 5500 before Common Era, these crafts had ripened into constant features of Neolithic life. Pottery became ubiquitous, not only kitchens but ritual fires, cooking labs, sauce vessels, pigment holders. Weaving ushered in clothing culture, brand symbols, and the earliest fabric-based social status. Over 7,000 years before treadmills. Baskets and cordage improved storage and transport. Nets harvested fish and grains alike. Cloth binders disguised land ownership. Specialization accelerated. Artisan roles expanded. The jar maker, the dyer, the weaver seer. Techniques passed matrilineally and patrilineally, often encoded in secret stitches or stamped motifs. These cultural gifts live long. Pottery shapes in Bronze Age form. Cloth-style insignia among Celtic weavers. Leaf pattern motifs in Iron Age ceramics. Even modern textile patterns sometimes echo the earlier weaving swirls. Chapter 7. Boom, Bust, and the First Plagues. Circa 6000 before Common Era to circa 4500 before Common Era. From around 6000 before Common Era onward. Neolithic communities across the Fertile Crescent, Anatolia, Balkilo-Anums, and parts of Central Crescent, Anatolia, Balkilo-Anums, and parts of Central Europe rode a powerful demographic surge. New villages sprouted across river valleys and plateaus. Fields extended into less soils. Society thrummed with the energy of growth. Yet along with population came pressure. Relentless stress on crops, soil, and human health. In many regions, around 5500 to 5000 before Common Era, the first broad epidemics swept through. driving village abandonment, ritual realignment, and survival strategies that would echo through millennia. Population surges and village overcrowding b. circa 5700 to 5500 before Common Era. Many linear pottery culture, LBK settlements in Central Europe, housed 1,200 individuals, clustered in tight rows of longhouses, sharing wells, hearths, and birthing spaces. Migration pressure and land sharing meant that territorial density rose. There was little fallow left to give soil respite. Households that had once subsisted with 2 or 3 storage jugs now kept 12 to 15 store jars scattered beneath their floors, grain reserves pressed against reed mats. Crowded conditions increased resource churn and amplified rumor, from "her house smells of stale barley" to "the well water darkened after the feast." As villages elongated along flood plains, microbial pools circulated more easily. Infant mortality, a perennial sorrow, rose beyond 50% in many years, often buried under the same hearth that once nursed them. 2. Agricultural stress and seasonal famine across 5,500 to 5,000 before Common Era. Seasonal rains became errata. Circa soil exhaustion from repeated cropping led to declining yields. Villagers in Anatolia and the Levant recorded only half the harvest they'd seen 50 years prior, and had to rely on imported wheat from the north. When grain shrank, so did ritual continuity. Feasts delayed. Masks of ancestors were moved into darker niches. Storage pits, once covered with reed lids, stayed open, inviting rot or weevils. Gossip rippled fast. They stored the barley beneath the cooking smoke. Moths ate it, or the priestess did not sprinkle salt across the pit. That's why the bread failed. In some villages, grain rationing became enforced. Elders calculated how many bowls each household could take, too little for most. A single missed portion became rumor fodder. She ate twice her share. Now no rain comes. These rules sparked tension and petty sabotage, as neighbors threatened to throw dry husks into communal ovens. 3. Emerging epidemics and contagion shadows. The hallmarks of early plagues began between circa 5,400 and 5,200 before Common Era. Though names were unknown, symptoms were familiar. High fevers, swollen glands, hideous boils, respiratory collapse. Death came fast. Families buried children and grandparents within a week. Ritual avenues faltered. Elders seers who once predicted harvest from skull masks went mute, villagers noted. The painted mouths cracked before they died. As bodies piled, farmhouse dwellings were abandoned, or walled up ceremonially with household gear inside. Ritual sites sealed, statues buried. The scale of plague shook social memory. It became allegorical. The fire passed unseen, they would whisper, speaking of invisible threats that seeped through walls and hearths, and took no knife but took breath. 4. Ritual surges, feast days and purification rites. When crops shrank or the fever crept, villages cycled into mass purification ceremonies. Feasts where grain was ritually returned to the earth, ovens lit in triumph, rivers barreled with offerings. People danced around makeshift bonfires holding charred clay vessels and burnt whorls dripping red pigment. During these feasts, scapegoat masks were made, clay or woven, often shaped in lion faces or serpent coils, and worn by accused thieves or ritual challengers. Those fined at feast events might offer up a terracotta mask, promising, "I'll wear it at every moon until rain returns." Should the rains fail again, rumors accused the mask wearer of magicirca. Many masks littered pathways, abandoned to rivers. 5. Economic collapse and reconstruction cycles from circa 5,200 to 4,800 before Common Era. Some regions witnessed complete village desertion. Houses burned, fields abandoned, a patterned hiatus of occupation lasting generations. In parts of the Levant, sites show pause zones, empty for 150 to 300 years before resettlement. Yet, Neolithic resilience shone when small groups returned. During circa 4,1800 to 4,500 before Common Era, these new founding cells built smaller clusters, 20 to 30 houses, often with improved practices. Multi-crop fields, wheat, barley, lentils, peas, flax together. Pest-resistant seedlines, semi-fallow oats. Rotations. Villagers whispered, "We sow 4 seeds now, not 2. Or our granary sits inside reed arches." Mold no longer creeps. From mash-fed cow dung came better soils. Sheep grazed adjacent ridges and fertilized fields. These innovations arose from crisis, even as they sparked fresh rumors. They imported sheep whose jowls don't heal. Evil blood. 6. Gossip, plague, and social reputation in plague years. Gossip became survival talk. Rites existed to locate blame. He walked barefoot through village footprints. Now his wife is blind. Or they spoke in the night beside last year's dead. They do rituals with ghosts. Even infant clothing was suspect. His shirt is woven with borrowed thread. They said she touched the wrong loom. Plague survivors gained unwanted prestige. She buried them all. Now let her walk last in ceremony. Their homes were felt to hold spectral memory. Some were left uninhabited. Others passed to strangers as cursed dowries. Rumor also shaped social action. Thank the weaver's cord was sealed. Or, if the pot cracked during the blessing, they said the seed will spoil next year. These murmurs directed feast participation, craft sharing, and even marriage alliances. 7. Cultural adaptations and lasting innovation. B. Circa 4500 before Common Era, several adaptive threads had emerged. Complex crop pachylo-anamges, mixing drought-resistant pulses with grains, preservation in ceramic jars coated in lime. Grain loans, community-held seed shares with written token systems, not yet writing, but not coded strips in baskets, traded between households. Sanitized granaries, reed-lined, smoke-infused, and occasionally sealed with plaster. A practice expanded from mask cavity plaster. Epidemic awareness. Villages began rituals in advance of spring, fumigating houses, isolating sick, burying dead outside the cluster. Many of these practices, born from crisis, became tradition. When ritual masks mirrored older skull masks with new pigments, they echoed the cycles of plague and renewal. When drought returned, logs were stored sideways to simulate terrace cycles. Potters incised soil profiles into ceramic handles. Knowledge and rumor fused. Chapter 8. Walls, mass graves, and village violence. Circa 5500 before Common Era to circa 4500 before Common Era, as the Neolithic horizon deepened. From circa 5500 before Common Era to circa 4500 before Common Era, settlements that once nervously circled. Land ran like a razor's edge between harvest and hunger. Some villages became fortress rings of safety. Others succumbed to the worst of their neighbors. When walls could not hold, mass graves marked the end of innocence. And a new chapter of neighbor against neighbor violence began. From dug ditches to defensive walls across the lowest plains, longhouses gathered into arrays. By circa 5300 before Common Era, some like the Central European LBK communities began trebling wide enclosures. Villagers hauled earth into ovoid ditches over 2 m deep and raised palisades of split oak posts that ringed longhouse clusters. These were not ceremonial rondels. They were warning signs. We stand, or we fall as one. Entry was limited. Tasks like fire keeping or grain distribution now needed licensed key holders, and feasts felt stretched between those inside and those outside the palisade. 2. Shadows over the grain store. The first recorded massacre in one village near the Danube around 50 before Common Era. A hollow oak block, later found in sediments, once served as the grave shaft for 34 bodies. 16 children, several women, many men, all killed at dawn with sharp adze blows to skulls and necks. Those within were not defending. No shield fractures, no above-the-knee wounds. Just flecks splintered in flight. The perpetrators vanished, but the surviving households rebuilt their palisades twice as tall and vowed allegiance only to kin. Yet gossip followed. They came in spring, took our women, left the broken. 3. Schlitz and Herxheim. When conflict became spectacle further east, time's shadow deepened with 2 more tragedies. At one site, the ditch that once stood as protection became a pit where 200 bodies were later unearthed. Heads cloven, limbs missing. The fate of infants recorded in fragility. At another, over 500 individuals, not just locals but far-flung travelers, were butchered, their skulls stripped into cups, their flesh roasted and sometimes eaten during mass ceremonies. Scholars debate ritual versus warfare, but the outcome was identical. Villages feared their neighbors enough to seal them away in memory and grave. Rumor bearings and ritual control communities spun fears into speech. They dug a ditch bigger than ours, so they could lock us out or lure us in. Those who refused to build the wall brought illness in their pots. They painted white ash across the threshold to protect us. The mask of the instructor cracked at feast night, so the archers came with adze in hand. When a longhouse burned, speculation flew. Whether it was rival kin or someone's daughter denied a bride price. Scapegoating became cultural script. We tied the firekeeper's mask to the palisade stakes and left it at dawn. 5. Ritual at the end. Between violence and renewal and years after violence, survivors still met in enclosed courtyards. But their rituals changed. Grieving clans pressed handprints of red ochre across wall palisade bases. They called them blood pacts, acknowledging loss and pledging peace. At summer solstice, they placed broken longhouse posts onto embers and carried each burnt shard through fire to rid memory of occupation. Masks were worn by children born the year after the massacre, lighting torches in the middle of the village to show the others they would not forget. When new houses rose, the walls had narrower gates. The ovens stood deeper inside. The dead were buried at periphery, eyes to the palisade, warning invaders or descendants. 6. Hunger, violence and survival in context around 5100 before Common Era. Fields faltered leading to famine. Grain stored beneath palisaded pits congealed in moisture or collapsed under red ochre weight. As food ran out, fights flared. One rumor stretches across centuries. They counted noses, then bowls, too many bowls. Too many bowls, not enough grain. Even the priest's child died. Farmers whispered. We traded young pigs to them across the ditch, but they had knives hidden in husks. When solar storms darkened the sun, some blamed outsiders who sacrificed our youth behind the wall. Hunger turned neighbor to enemy. Walls became measures of both survival and mistrust. 7. Aftermath and social memory. B. Circa 4800 before Common Era. Most fortressed LBK settlements had abandoned longhouse rows, or were deserted altogether. New groups repopulated the land, but kept the same rituals. Children still left offerings on the former ditches. Potters etched small crosses on clay pits, as if to map new boundaries. Villages next to those ditches assigned firekeepers oaths, where the first flame each year had to be shared at the gate, not inside or beyond. Sacred days tied to ditch alignment marked turning points. After winter planting, after midsummer rains, after first harvest, gossip persisted. When we opened the gate at dawn, we name only 3 clans allowed, or the wall shakes. 8. Innovations from ruin and tragedy yielded new structures, contracted rights. Only married pairs and seed keepers were trusted to pass through the gates during ceremonies. Canonical lists. An earliest form of accountability was created. Strings tied to fence posts marking how many jars each household held. Codified alliances. Neighboring clan groups exchanged daughters as peace pledges, physically bridging walls. This era created the first memory architecture. Walls spoken of in ritual, violence remembered in grain rights. Chapter 9. Monuments under northern skies. Circa 5500 before Common Era to circa 3000 before Common Era. From roughly circa 5500 before Common Era onward, Neolithic communities stretched their reach beyond harvest and earth into stone. A new wave of monument building swept across Western Europe, starting in Brittany, spreading through Ireland and Britain, veering towards Scandinavia. Massive passage graves, long barrows, henges, and alignment rows transformed landscape and social life. These monuments reshaped identity, labor, rivalry, and ritual, binding villagers to ancestors, storms to ceremony, and gossip to granite. 1. Stone towers and passage graves emerged around circa 1800 to 4200 before Common Era. Early chambered tombs began rising from Brittany's glacial ridges, most notably the Barnenez cairn, a monumental mound of over 15,000 tons of stone, with at least 11 chambers and engraved slabs. Building it took hundreds of people months to quarry, shape, and pile rock in ritual form. Villagers spoke of their labor in whispers. Our flock brought each stone, but he who cut the eastern pillar slept in the cairn's shadow. The cairn became a gravity anchor. Kin buried inside gained land claims. Rival families cursed its presence. It flickered between pity and power. 2. Atlantic networks. Stones stretch coast to coast following the cairns. Long barrow traditions spread along the Atlantic seaboard, reaching Ireland, Britain, the Low Countries, and southern Scandinavia between circa 4000 and 3000 before Common Era. Farmers dragged massive capstones to elevated knolls. Places like Gavrini's, Newgrange, Meagrange, Maze Howe, and West Kennet Long Barrow echoed with ancestral names. In these new tombs, graves for dozens of people, often random ancestors, not single individuals, were enclosed with chromatic stones and megalith art. These monuments were leveling places. All clans poured bones beneath the same capstone, but competition surfaced. Their chamber stands over my field, yet their seeds fail, villagers muttered. Soil fertility became linked to monument grandeur. Failing to build tall meant your field's doomed. 3. Henges and solar sanctuaries. While tomb building pulsed along coasts, in Central Europe another architectural revolution was underway. Starting near circa 1900 before Common Era, the stickband ceramic (CK) communities constructed rondels. Circular earthen enclosures, like the one at Goseck, Germany, aligned to winter and summer solstice, sunrise and sunset. These may be the earliest solar sanctuaries, predecessors to later Stonehenges. By circa 3000 before Common Era, large circles like Stonehenge, Durrington Walls, and the Ring of Brodgar emerged in Britain. Abbé and geographer Alexander Thom claimed these were celestial calendars, carefully placed stones marking horizon lights. Villagers whispered anxiously during construction. He placed the north gate too far west, so the harvest festival will fall on storm. Or they slipped the heelstone, and now the midsummer sun misses the axis. Ritual fire lit up these circles. A flutist half-burned reed would begin each seasonal rite. Gossip spoke of flame smoke illusions. We lit fire behind the stone. Only the seer climbed its peak first, or a broken sarsen moaned at dusk. It was his old heart complaining. 4. Labor, role, and regional rivalries. The prize of a monument hinged on labor coordination. Barnenez needed rotation teams of 50 men hauling granite. Goseck settlers timed sun events precisely, each sunrise marking a shift of chore or rank. Villages became labor calendars. Those who refused to serve gossip had that spelled out. They chopped only 3 cartloads of stone. The circle song cracked. Craft specialization emerged. Stonemasons, dome setters, earth diggers, fire keepers, intendants of alignment. These were not household roles. They were new ritual classes. Those who sank megaliths earned seasonal seats at ancestral ceremonies. Others watched from afar, resentful. When the seer planted the east circle, he said, "Your bones are moved." Hierarchy shifted from hearth to henge. 5. Rituals of granite, grain, and gossip feast and monument fused. Each ringed circle or barrow required grain offerings, animal sharing, and torchlit processions. Reed-wrapped jars filled with barley were sunk beside chamber walls. Goat carcasses offered in pits below long barrow capstones. These rituals created spectral kin. Masks and shell mirrors glowed in lantern light, carried ancestors to flame. Gossip thrums in ritual stories. They offered no grain at the north chamber. The hawk stole their sentinel, or his voice froze at the circle. They said his clan plagiarized the blueprint. Masks were recycled seasonally. Shards were read like wrecked runes. Ceremonies began to imitate architecture. Every circle echoed inside. 6. Conflict by rivalry, not blood. Unlike the massacres of the LBK world, Circa around 5000 before Common Era, the megalithic builders rarely fought in open violence. Instead, competition for monument prestige became the blood of rivalry. Clans that built bigger barrows claimed superior rights to land, grain, and marriage alliances. When one village raised a massive cairn, neighbors might refuse share. A village without a long barrow lost status. At their feast, they named us last. Across frozen stone, they whispered. Some families buried elders outside the circle purposely, to spite the builders. Let them walk past the barrow and feel the wind. Such tension sometimes escalated. In a few rare cases, excavated sites show graves dug beneath foundations, hinting that dissenters were killed or exiled rather than honored. But open extermination gave way to ostracism, ritual exclusion, shaming masks hung at monument perimeters. 7. Cultural legacy. Monuments in memory B. Circa 3000 before Common Era. Large-scale monument construction had subsided, likely due to combination of wear on soil, labor cost, and shifting ritual systems. Yet its legacy endured. Landscape memory. Barrows and circles marked territorial boundaries. Their tomb stands at our edge, whispered travelers centuries later in mapping. Ritual calendars. Seasonal ceremonies based on alignments survived in folklore and later Bronze Age festival use. Ancestor-based identity. Kin groups continued to honor family tombs. Old barrows became reused sites in Bronze Age burials. Artistic language. Stone carvings echo plow, mark patterns. Spiral glyphs became proto-writing. Hammer motifs appear etched in pottery. Chapter 10. Masks, Myths, and Ritual Drama. Circa 5000 before Common Era to circa 3500 before Common Era. As the Neolithic world moved between circa 5500 and 3500 before Common Era, ritual entered a new phase. The same societies that had built grand tombs and communal temples now gave voice to masks, carved, painted, worn, through which ancient faces, mythical beings, and cosmic stories gained haunting power. In village squares and subterranean temples alike, masked enactment wove drama into daily life, ritual into identity, and gossip into the ever-deepening tapestry of belief. 1. Faces of power, from stone to flesh at caves like Nahal Hamar. Perched above the Dead Sea, villagers crafted limestone masks, lifelike visages with hollow eyes and tooth-open mouths. Over 9,000 years ago, though they stand slightly earlier, their tradition resurfaced along Zenobia's horizons for millennia. By circa 5500 before Common Era, echoes appeared in the Balkilo Annams. The Vinča culture produced highly stylized anthropomorphic figurines with oval faces, incised eyes, and folded arms, small ritual idols imbued with agency and mythic weight. These masks and figures served as more than relics. They were public avatars. On feast nights, costume wearers brought them alive. The stone carcass held to the chest, the eyes flicking in torchlight, the carved figure pointed at newlywed couples or rival kin. When her mask opened its jaw, villagers said, "The market falls silent." Dancers draped behind dark tapestries mimicked serpents, ancestors, or seated spirits, turning myth into movement. 2. Seasonal pageants and ritual dramas followed the farming cycle. At spring sowing, masked actors, men in reed-woven grain skin aprons, entered the center of circles like those at Stonehenge or Gossek, and enacted the death and rebirth of the seed god. Actors would pretend to crumble, rise from false teeth of plastered clay, and inhale first blossoms. Women would enclose them in woven vines, whispering praises to ancestor skull masks as incense smoked. At midsummer harvest, masked serpent priests danced before long barrows. Their carved wooden masks bore stylized animal faces, shells for eyes, and painted constellations on hollowed belly plates. Audience participants passed braided grain across their masked brows in a hushed chain, sealing alliance through touch. "If he stumbles," one seer declared, "our summer fails." Rumor swelled in the wings. "They don't raise the mask high enough. The air will pierce the harvest." Or, when her serpent mask hissed at the wind, he skipped 2 planting rows. Panic followed if the wrong person slipped behind a mask. The rains would halt. Free masks, rumor and the limits of authority. Mask wearers held immense power and risked terrible backlash. Only certain families could craft or wear masks, levers of authority far surpassing granary chiefs or clan elders. At funerary rituals near long barrows, a mask-wearing child might recite genealogies before the tomb, twined as our soil with the blood of founders. But neighbors whispered, she learned her lines only from her father's mask, not from our fields. When missing, masks spawned crisis. They stole our mask from the shrine. Our fields failed until it returned. Scapegoat masks illustrated communal blame. During plague or drought, villagers crafted crude straw figures of accused women or outsiders, donning the plague mask for a day, then sending the figure with ashes to the boundary ditches. Gossip circulated that the masked doll smelled of lost children. Families downstream refused to drink rainwater. The spectacle aligned moral reparation with healing theater. 4. Problems, paranoia, and myth in the mask traditions brought problems. Craft secrets leaked. She stained her mask with pigment from another's dye. Now lies creep into ancestral chant. Masks degraded old skull masks of amber people. Sometimes bones wore away or shells fell. Losing a mask meant dishonor or curses. Illusion unraveled. Mask eyes shone in midday sun, causing panic as villagers thought spirits watched them in daylight. Failed drama, Incesclo, Greece. One feast actor collapsed mid-motion, masks slipping into a fire shaft. Locals later forbade masked dances after midday for a decade. Most disturbingly, masks were sometimes implicated in violence. At one site, a mask owner was found strangled, but his mask remained on a stick at the doorway. Rumor blamed rival clan priestesses of the shell mirror. The ritual dichotomy between performer and performance blurred, raising questions. Who wore the power? And who controlled it? 5. Cultural transformation and enduring innovation even amid suspicion. Masks reshaped Neolithic culture. Standardized mask making. Families developed branded traditions. Vine and vine stone masks, split wood, owl face models, woven reed wrap, grain shield masks. Apprentices inherited pattern templates, pigment recipes, and wood types, proto-writing and symbolism. Many masks carried carved symbols, Vinča lines or solar spirals, believed to encode clan allegiance or ritual contracts. These glyphs may be ancestors of Bronze Age script. Ritual guilds, mask makers, dancers, seer priests formed guild-like circles tied not to family land, but to performance prestige. They negotiated grain shares during festivals, and some even mortgaged mask apprenticeships. Spatial theater. Communities built sun-tracked stages, platforms where masks faced rising sun on Beltane. Alleys between skull shrines and mask dwellers facilitated procession. Architecture mirrored ritual. As the Copper Age approached, mask production declined, but disguise and dramatic enactment persisted. Later Bronze Age funerary customs preserved the mask's metaphoric breadth. Indo-European warrior masks appear in pottery. 6. Legacy. How masks remember used to be circa 3500 before Common Era. Masks had largely disappeared, but their creative echo remained. In Bronze Age, Iana temples, priest shows, and tinted facial symbols may trace back to masked drama. In later folklore across Europe, seasons are enacted through masked dances, sometimes as mimic of ancient grain myth plays. Proto-writing glyphs on masks become script signs on jars and seals, a new way to wear identity. In bones found under long barrows, we see remnants of masks. Shell beads aligned like eyes, polished stone discs embedded in skulls. Tiny versions of worn applique. Rumors around masked lines also enshrined social mores. If you wear the mask with the wrong hand, your descendants shrivel. That whisper may echo today as superstition, but its root is ancient drama in seed-driven communities. Chapter 11. Seed stones and symbols of ownership. Circa 4500 before Common Era to circa 3200 before Common Era and communities across Anatolia, the Balkanoans, and Central Europe from about 4500 to 3200 before Common Era. Daily life became a negotiation of fields and symbols. As harvests grew, so did disputes. Who owned which plot? Who claimed which house? And who would guard the grain? In response, the Neolithic world began to encode ownership, not in speech, but in shape, stamp, and seed. Farmers marked land boundaries with engraved stones. Kin claimed grain by stamped clay, and clay tokens became early ledgers of surplus. This chapter explores how concrete symbols spawned new modes of property, debt, and ritual that reshaped village power. 1. Terroir. Landlines carved in stone where fields stopped, and pastures began. Moats of soil, ridges, and rough carved stones came to mark property lines. In the less farms north of the Danube, villagers carved blocky stones into wedge shapes, marker stakes, inserted into the ground at corners of plot boundaries. Each stone sloped into a family's land, stamped with a unique notch or spiral glyph to identify the owner. At harvest time, each villager knew where to erect the scare poles and share the fire pits. Rumors whispered, "The stone beside the ash heap belonged to my grandmother. If your carving fades, your claim drifts." These stakes served as physical claims, for grazing, for planting, and for marriage ties. When disputes arose, clans gathered by marker stones to negotiate. The marker remained quiet yet storm-prompting. If someone removed or defaced the carving, neighbors regarded it not as vandalism, but as declaration. We took the field, not the grain. 2. Clay token ledgers. Weighed as weapon of memory around circa 4000 before Common Era. Small clay tokens, miniature cones, discs, spheres, began circulating in Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Each shape corresponded to a commodity: sheep, beer, baskets of grain. Some were sealed inside hollow clay spheres tied with reed bark, sealed to mark accountability. These tokens tracked loans, shared labor, and inheritance. One token might say, 2 measures of barley, owed until spring, third-party guarantee. In villages, tokens were lent along with seed. A farmer handing one token to another might say, grow 4 seed kernels, keep 1, return 3 tokens at sowing. Rumors spread when tokens went missing. He ate the lamb, but kept the sheep disc. Owners often clipped the token's notches or inscribed rings to indicate origin or kin. Tokens thus became memory sculptures, records of what was stored, owed, or broken. 3. Stamp marks and pintadera. Personal property as pattern in the Balkylo-Anims and Aegean around 3800 before Common Era. Villagers pressed pintadera stamps, round or oval clay discs carved with spirals, combio marks, or gritty patterns. Onto bread mats. Baskets and body. These marks serve dual purposes, decorative and declarative. A basket stamped with spirals that looped inward meant household of the spring-born daughter. A pitch-stained bread loaf bore the same mark, reminding receivers of who baked it and who shared in its yield. These stamps operated like ancient brand. Stamped pottery stored seeds. Stamped clay tags inside pits marked grain ratios. Stamped cords around reed boxes signaled approved storage. When a stamped container was found empty, neighbors would snarl. Your mark claimed more grain than your plot could raise. 4. Glyphs of Vinča, where ownership meets Prado writing by circa 3500 to 3200 before Common Era. Potters of the Vinča culture in the Danube basin began inscribing simple signs on the lips, bases, or handles of pots. These Danube glyphs, straight lines, comb series, crosses, appeared on vessel clays, spindle whorls, and figurines. Scholars debate their meaning: accounting signs, clan symbols, seed quotas, but local villagers treated them as marks of identity and ownership. A pot bearing 3 parallel lines was recognized from King Line A. A newlywed wife bringing a pot stamped with that sign married into King Line B. In rumor, lines became lineage songs. If your mark matches mine, our seed aligns. Objects stamped for millennia endured, even when the glyph no longer translated into speech. Its presence shaped inheritance and identity. 5. Problems, paranoia, and the weight of seed claims these marking systems increased clarity, but also tension. Mark stones vanished under river silt, stamped seed stores were seized in surpluses, and glyphs were carved over by rivals. When famine hit, false tokens circulated to claim borrowed grain. When drought lingered, damaged pottery glyphs were blamed for cursed-tinted harvest. Some villages banned tokens during feasts. Others defaced markers to deny enemy access. Rumor turned into code. If your glyph is misshapen, your ancestors hunger. Owners marked tokens with hidden grooves to catch thieves. Prize glyphs were kept secret until feast day. Claiming property required both symbol and reputation. Cultural transformation and lasting innovations between circa 4500 and 3200 before Common Era. These symbols changed the very fabric of social memory. Property rights, seeds, land, and tools were now marked, tracked, and regulated, carving the first and regulated shaper-based laws. Proto-accounting. Tokens and stamps became non-verbal contracts, pre-writing that recorded debt, kinship, and exchange. Standardization. Clay shapes and glyphs gradually copied across villages. Pottery stamps became inherited mark templates. Ceramic identity. Stamped vessels, seed jars, and token-bundled sets became grave inclusions, symbolizing family rights and death. The earliest writing would emerge from this same tradition of clay and mark-making. But the real innovation here was the human ability to transmute disputes into symbols, both binding and breaking communal ties. Chapter 12. Climate shocks and migration waves. Circa 6200 before Common Era and circa 4200 before Common Era. From around circa 6200 before Common Era, the Earth's climate suddenly shifted. A centuries-long cooling, the also called 8.2 Kr event, brought drought across the Near East. Fields that had thrived went barren. Hearthside seed jars cracked. Villagers confronted environmental collapse, not from war, but from the sky. Just over 1,000 years later, at roughly circa 4200 before Common Era, the 4.2 Kr aridification, widespread drought cut across West Asia and Eastern Europe. Rivers failed, town states shrank, and whispers spread. The sky slides on empty breath. These two shocks reshaped human geography and society. Where once seeds bound families to land, drought forced them to wander. Migration waves radiated from Anatolian and Near Eastern heartlands across the Balkilo-Anums and into the Pontic steppe, drawing social landscapes. In droughted years, villages did not just gather grain. They migrated, reset, and renamed territory. 1. The first shock. 8.2 Kilo-Annum cooling and migration. Circa 6200 before Common Era. Circa 6200 before Common Era. Summers shortened and rainfall faded. Upland terraces near Lake Tuz cracked in clay. Cereals grew thin, and barley rinds hardened twice as thick. Over decades, early settlement sites, like Saddlehoyuk-style clusters, witnessed higher infant death, lower skeletal growth, and a rise in house abandonment. By around 6150 before Common Era, arrows of migration fanned northward. Domesticated grain cultivators moved along river routes from Anatolia into central Greece, the Sesklo region, and then northeast across the Danube into present-day Serbia and Hungary. This wave, in retrospect labeled the Starchevo-Kuras, Krine culture, reached inland settlements by about 6200 to 6000 before Common Era. Villagers built new houses, bolder foundations, and less plaster walls. Shaped after Anatolian prototypes, they carried burnt grain winnowing baskets, red ochre pigments, and reedsword weaving tech from their southern origin. Places said, her clan came from the Salt Lake. They brought flame and seed. Gossip followed. They bore no scars from grain mold. They carved seed by summer sweat. Yet newcomers also cut claims. The same clans that fled drought often outgrew locals through shared labor and better seed lines. Where the seed failed, ritual memory survived. 2. Ritual reinvention and rumor financing these years. Ritual adapted swiftly. Villages broken and rebuilt marked the sky by stories of thunderless winters. Drought feasts exchanged small quantities of seed in ceremonial knots woven around jar handles. They called them seed lowens. When rain returned, repayments became memory bonds. Rumor tracked generosity and greed. You took 3 instead of 2 knots. If debts weren't honored, villagers said, your mask shell fell off, so did the sky. Processions arose. Carpets of barley stems were carried upstream to rivers. Houses were smeared with white ash from burned reeds. At midwinter feasts, an enacted sky murder drama replaced ancestral mask worship. After a ritual fire smokes down, the eldest returns the ember to the hearth. Rekindle life. Villagers whisper. These adaptation rituals emerged to domesticate climate, calming storms rather than planting fear. 3 died twide. The second shock. 4.2 Kayar drought and desertification, circa 4200 before Common Era. By circa 4200 before Common Era, after generations of new growth, a sharper crisis struck. The 4.2 Kayar dry event, intense and prolonged, cracked fields from Mesopotamia to the Carpathian Basin. Rain retreated to mountains, rivers shifted. Some water meadows dried permanently. The effect was dramaticirca, early Chalcolithic markers. Bureaucratic tokens, painted pottery halls, like those at Vinča and Tesassalos, collapsed. Multi-mound settlements emptied. Villages were abandoned for centuries. As grain failed, people migrated again. Some southwest across the Dinaric Hills, others east into the Pontic steppe. These migrations opened the door to steppe pastoralists, who intermingled with local survivors, bringing herding, horse riding, and eventually Bronze Age kits of ritual and language taught for migration, mixing and conflict lines the newcomers, linked to what scholars call the Kurgan or Yamnaya horizon, were pastoralists who embraced herding over sowing. They entered evacuated villages, raised rings of fences, and reused burial pits to assert land claims. Indigenous clans watched them shape new herds and burn reeds for plowland. Rumor went wild. They speak with hooves, not speech. They poured fire into the masked skull. Our ancestors cursed them. Mixed burial cemeteries emerged. Children born of local mothers and stepfathers were buried with both axe and spindle whorl, keystones of identity from both traditions. Story cycles circulated around these mixed lineage children. Hay veils apples in our mask patterns, seeds in their belt maces. 5 Dart Olad Shuwagrai, adaptation, ritual calendars and new institutions following the second crisis, ritual and bureaucracy came to the fore. Climate feasts became scheduled. Every 26-year cycle, a survivor's feast recalled the 4.2 kiloannum drought. Masked parades marched in memorial. Seed token rituals became complex. Surviving villages and steppe newcomers forged token pairs sealed in clay spheres to mark cross-skin marriages. Marker stakes adapted layer marks. They marked not only land, but world time marks, recounting which harvest failed and which migrated, carved in spiral glyphs. These innovations became political. Mosaic pattern tokens were exchanged in ritual courts. Snow classes took their place around seed trading feasts. Steppe warriors sometimes married into farmer households in exchange for grain kits. T16. I warrior golden gossip, scarcity and social scripts through both shocks. Rumor served as climate commentary. Their grain knot bears 2 loops. They claim 2 harvests, but their tokens missing a seal. They poured ash into the well at dusk. Their fields fail each season. Their winter flautist skipped a reed line. Now their child will speak in thunder. These rumors were not idle. They shaped ritual legitimacy. Rumor regulated loans, punished plant harding, and even prevented marriages across stressed lines. Gossip served as semiotic sanction. Chapter 13. Horses, Copper, and the Edge of Bronze. Circa 4800 before Common Era to circa 3500 before Common Era. Circa 4800 before Common Era. The great stone villages of old Europe glimpsed a new light. Copper, metal, gold adornment, and on the eastern horizon, the horse. Over the next 1,000 years, societies in the Balkilo Annams and steppe adopted copper axes, traded horses, and built fame through wagons and wagoner lineages. This chapter traces how animal, ore, wheel, and word shaped a new age, unlocking power, conflict, prestige, and a sometimes curse. 1. Dawn of copper sparks and wagon wheels in the heartlands of the Balkilo Anims, after flourishing vine-engraved villages of the Vinča culture. The first copper axes and awls emerged by circa 4700 to 4600 before Common Era. Early furnaces, pits brimming with slag, and crater-like hearths fired ore from Rudna and Ibunar Mainstadt. At Plochnik, one of the earliest copper workshops, craftsmen melted native copper in bellows-fed blowpipes, forging shaft-hole axes by circa 5500 before Common Era, making metallurgy practical and portable. These axes were not tools only. They were trophies, tokens of craft, and barters for alliance too. Gold glitter, and the rich dead between circa 4600–4200 before Common Era. The coastal necropolis of Varna, modern Bulgaria, buried elites with thousands of gold and copper objects. Some graves contained more gold than was seen in later Pyramid Age Egypt. Copper bracelets, polished axes, flint blades, and shell beads often outweighed human remains. These objects spoke. We are privileged by craft, tied to mines, married through trade. Houses associated with these burials became mythic. Neighbors gossiped that Varna's gold begat rain, or that copper thieves called storms down if their target resisted. 3. Smelting systems and mine rituals. Copper craft spawned ritual sentences of shape and place. Mining pits had bodies of burnt reeds, placed like sacred fire poles. Slag hearths at Rudna had stone settings, each grove aligned toward solar shadows at equinox. Smelters, revered as flamemen, swallowed the poison of copper smoke and emerged as wielder priests. In intimate households, apprentices whispered raw metal secrets. If you inhale the green dust of malachite, your children won't see winters. Smelter women carried sacred shards of slag, pressed into clay as protective amulets over doorways. 4. Horse at the gate. The first tame hoofs. Although humans had hunted horses for millennia, full domestication began to ripple across Eurasia, only by circa 3500 before Common Era. In the Batai culture of northern Kazakhstan, these people penned horses in corrals, wore tooth-check bits, and milked mares in pottery jugs. The horse appears in the Balkilo Anims only slightly later, by circa 3800 before Common Era, entering through river valleys with pastoral migrants. At first only a few stallions, a dark-mannered gift, then more. They shook grain sovereignty, inspired diplomatic marriages, and were woven into ancestral myth. 5. Steppe riders and Yamnaya caravans. Pastoralists of the Yamnaya horizon, circa 3500 before Common Era onward, embraced horses fully and carried copper knowledge westward. Though Yamnaya elites buried few copper artifacts, their two-wheeled ox-drawn wagons and horse bones speak of mobility. Skeletons show leg and pelvis stress consistent with riding. Some graves contain blade axes worn at the wrist as status. As riders pressed into Europe, copper-marked tokens paired with wagons carried messages across plains. Marital alliances wove rider clans with local farmers. Gift exercise exchange of mares for seed carts became ritual code. 6. Forge feasts and iron. Before Iron Kings in many villages, coppersmiths held a kind of ritual monarchy. The red glow seers. They ran forge feasts, offering axes at seasonal gates. Copper ingots were displayed on altars. Metallurgists passed sweat-wrenched tongues in silent ceremony. Guests whispered, "Let him be struck with the axe of summer first," meaning the youngest smith apprentices led summer work. Rumor held that forged gifts carried ancestral power, and that rivals who accepted an axe gift without proper guest ritual could be cursed with a bad harvest. 7. Prestige and problems. Splinters, poison, and overreach. Copper gleamed, but it wounded. Splintering an axe at harvest meant gossip. Her copper axe cracked inside the grain. Her seed will fail. Long-term exposure caused a faint metallic taste in children's blood. Stroke-like tremor in elders who lived near smelting hearths, and copper miners buried young of possible anemia. Horses too fell sick. A hoof disease called Spring studs cropped up in herds crossing rough terrain. Villages held festival cleansings, bathing herds in rivers, then reciting oath tokens at the mine aid, whispered curses and alloy alliances. The era progressed. Rumors encircled early bronze experiments, small creations of copper and tin via accidental alloying. One shinier axe found near Plochnik hinted at tin bronze from circa 3700 before Common Era, a century before Bronze Age legendary. Towns whispered it was cursed. The green-blue blade lessens prime ministers of spring. Tin suppliers were treated warily. One mine owner from central Serbia was rumored to sleep outside his workshop, for fear the blaze would open a passage to ancestral Wrath 9. Legacy: from Copper Seed to Bronze Age gravitas circa 3500 before Common Era, Europe had changed. Copper was everywhere. Horse newcomers had settled. Token systems bearing seed and horse glyphs connected farms to wagons. Labor teams flowed along wagon roads. Elites bore red metal torques to harvest feasts. Villages split. Older lines dug in with bronze woman's glyphs. Newer lines claimed ridge plots with copper axes framed on hearth pedestals. Though true bronze, copper or steel bronze, was still a century off. The foundations, shared metallurgy, horse mobility, surplus-led memory, foreshadowed the coming Bronze Age kingdoms. Chapter 14. Bread, Bones, and Health in Transition. Circa 10,000 before Common Era to circa 3,000 before Common Era. In the span from approximately 10,000 before Common Era to 3,000 before Common Era, humanity transitioned from scattered bands of foragers to grain-grazing societies. This shift spurred radical changes in health, nutrition, and skeletal biology, sometimes for the better, often for the worse. In this chapter, we trace the arc of change: the primeval adoption of bread grain at the dawn of farming, the rise of dental decay, growth stunting, and the first organismal epidemics. Human bones and teeth remember these millennia, not with words, but with lines, lesions, and lamellae toward one, from wild seeds to dough. The shift in diet starting around circa 10,000 before Common Era. Early farmers in the Fertile Crescent and expanding into Europe began domesticating cereals, einkorn, barley, emmer wheat, transitioning from wild seeds to dense, agricultural staples. By circa 6,000 to 3,000 before Common Era, stable carbon nitrogen isotope analyses across Neolithic sites in Iberia, Britain, Italy, and the Balkylo Annams show that plant foods composed 75–90% of the diet, while animal protein remained secondary. This was especially true in inland villages devoid of coastal marine food sources. Here and elsewhere, isotope studies reconstruct diet from bones and teeth via diversity. Much of the protein was starchy, processed through grinding and fermentation. The backbone of daily sustenance. 2. The smile that fails. Tooth decay and enamel stresses. Cereal ingestion increased. Cavities, dental caries, soared. In multiple early LBKK culture cemeteries, circa 5,500 to 4,800 before Common Era, dental remains from over 100 adults show that 20% suffered caries or antemortem tooth loss directly tied to carbohydrate wear. Meanwhile, linear enamel hypoplasia, lay horizontal grooves and pits in tooth enamel, appeared in up to 70% of Neolithic individuals across Europe, indicating interrupted dental development tied to childhood stress. Hypoplasia commonly co-occurs with cribra orbitalia and porotic hyperostosis, bone lesions reflecting iron deficiency anemia, and chronic infection. These conditions peak in Central European LBK skeletons, especially in Western LBK sites, where reduced meat consumption is inferred from isotopes. Hypoplasia frequency, mirrored growth disruption. Fractured enamel often corresponds to stunted adult height, typical in malnourished infants. 3. Weaning, infant fragility, and growth. Arrest new mothers introduced cereal gruels early, sometimes before 6 months. exposing infants to parasites and nutritional deficiency prematurely. P values show abrupt declines at around 4-6 months, marking early weaning habits. These correlate with higher LAH values and mortality rates among infants whose weaning foods were predominantly grain. Glyphs lines, Harris lines observed in femur X-rays also indicate episodes of systemic stress, recurrent bouts of starvation, infection, or metabolic disruption lasting weeks to months during adolescence. 4. Stain, bones and bugs, plague, tuberculosis and jumping microbeaches, sedentary populations burgeoned and people lived in denser villages. Zoonotic and human-to-human diseases spread rapidly. Morphological and ancient TDNA evidence confirmed tuberculosis, TB, in Neolithic farmers, possibly transmitted from the close-quarter proximity with animals and other humans. Cases dated to circa 6,200 to 5,500 before Common Era in the Levant, and circa 5,400 to 4,800 before Common Era in LBK settlements in Germany, Hungary, and Poland show spinal lesions consistent with TB, often alongside periosteal bone restructuring. Unconcurrently, early Yersinia pestis genomes isolated from Neolithic remains in the Baltic and Croatia indicate incidental plague presence predating Bronze Age pandemics by centuries, or even millennia. These infections often co-occurred with comorbidities like anemia, suggesting compounding health burdens in dense communities. 5. Social responses. Ritual, rumor, and medical culture faced with creeping fragility. Communities developed health-oriented rituals. Grain-smeared masks at planting festivals served dual functions: appeasing ancestral disease and reinforcing fertility. In some cases, communal feast days included urine or herbal cleansing rites, ancient forms of purification possibly tied to water contamination or vector control. Rumors linked neglect with blame. She must have broken the tooth mask at the feast. Our child coughs now. People used gossip to enforce hygiene and ritual compliance. Mothers whose children developed bone lesions were sometimes said to eat doze too early, i.e. wean improperly. 6. Resilience and biological adaptation despite pressure. Some communities adapted. Genetic studies point to the rise of lactase persistence, alleles around 4,500 to 3,500 before Common Era, likely offering protein and vitamin D from milk products in low-sun northern latitudes, compensating iron-deficient grain diets. By the end of this chapter's period, around 3000 before Common Era, overall health metrics show slight improvement. Tooth wear patterns indicate softer milling styles. Later weaning times emerge, and cognitive development markers suggest fewer growth arrests in later generations. Ceramics increasingly served as dental cleaning tools. Potholes show fine grooves used to abrade, suggesting people discovered early mechanical ways to reduce cavity risk. Chapter 15. Chatter in the Granary. Rumor, Power, and Taboo. Across the full Neolithic time span, from circa 10,000 before Common Era to circa 3,000 before Common Era, when grain first lay in ceramic jars or sunk into sunken pits, food storage unleashed not just bounty, but a whispery theater of control. The granary became a zone of public suspicion, strategic secrecy, ritual etiquette, and rumor-driven justice. Over 6,000 years, word of mouth oversaw seed allocation, shaped taboos, and policed unseen transgressions. Because what could not be watched over was talked up. 1. Seed, silence, and the first whisperers. The Neolithic granary started simple. Small clay bin pits holding little more than a family's yearly barley or wheat reserve. At sites like Çatalhöyük, circa 7,000 to 6,000 before Common Era, such pits were clustered near hearths, obscured behind jars or drying racks, ever vulnerable to missing kernels or curious eyes. In these pits, women and seed keepers stored surplus grain saved for planting, drought, or ritual. Noticing who scooped from these jars without offering a grain or silence became a form of social currency. Whispered accusations of empty abalooned pits became sharper than clay sticks. Sometimes entire pot groups were abandoned when neighbors stopped trusting who had claimed corners of the silo too. Choreographed access and rule of the whisper access to storage was tightly governed. Some Neolithic houses constructed low ledges for jars within sight of doorways. Others hid pits behind woven screens. Seasonal rituals, such as solstice feasts, often began with a going round of grain measurement. A husked knife, a folded reed tally, a branded pit lid. Women tasked with seed delivery were carefully observed. Rumor ensured compliance. The same woman carried jars too often, or returned with jarfuls. Whispers would circulate. She has bread for herself, but no fire for us. Over time, villages often posted watch nights during harvest to discourage unobserved grain removal, or swapped jars early to audit accounts. 3. Quiet sanctions of scarcity. Rumors shaped community responses. When grain fell short, clans convened. Masked seers declared, just 2 jars per house. But whispers by ear named repeat offenders. She kept the last bean under her habit. No formal law existed, but rumor drove social sanction. Ostracizing houses from feast cycles, excluding the accused from seed loan networks. Taboos too arose naturally. Some jars became taboo at certain times. Mid-harvest plague rituals, believed to carry impurity. Touching these jars, for example during death rituals, could provoke rumors that plague followed. Recipes leaked drought. 4. Gossip as ritual reinforcement. Even in villages that had stopped resettling, rumor-shaped cycle. A seer might recite rice lore only under a jar pit, declaring its owner condemned if the rain didn't come. The speech was structured. Honor grain, commit greed, you bury seed under the earth, release rumor in return. This created a feedback loop. Rumor enforced ritual, ritual licensed rumor. Vaults beneath storage pits sometimes held discarded querns, spindle whorls, or broken jugs. Objects said to have stuck to angry jars from rumor narratives of hoarding ghosts. Ritual drama mimicked rumor. A masked child might confront an empty silo under moonlight, miming theft in communal spectacle. 5. Dirt, seeds, tokens, and whispered ledgers. B. Circa 4000 before Common Era. Clay tokens and stamped seals began entering seed economies. Cones for sheep, discs for grain. Detailed tokens sealed beneath longhouse floors. These tokens function as memory aids, but rumor remained the only enforcement. Tokens were transacted like verbal contracts. If tokens misaligned with jars, rumor flared. He gave 2 discs but hid the jar beneath the floor. That whisper compelled shrines to nullify the token contract publicly through ritual effigy burning. A phonetic ritual that traded rumor for tablets of ash, marking social forgiveness. Rumor scanned the mismatch. Ritual erased it with grain lies. 6. Rumor declines. Structure survives as granaries grew, which happened in late Chalcolithic and proto-urban sites. Storage often fell under specialized control. Villager labor rotations managed surplus. Compacts with smith priests or feast masters held official access. Yet rumor lingered as informal audit. A masked accountant's apprentice might later be gossiped as the only one who could tell real grain from glaze. Even when storage became bureaucratic, rumor shaped social balance. Coalitions, grain worship guilds, smithing caste, traded jar control for scattering of rumor, and rumors shaped reputation, influencing marriage exchanges, trade alliances, trust across fields, and survived long after tokens wore away in pottery shards. Chapter 16. Collective memory. Marble-toed ziggurat construction. Circa 3200 before Common Era to circa 2000 before Common Era. By circa 3200 before Common Era, the shadow of the Neolithic in the Fertile Crescent flickered into a new structure. Urbanism and bureaucracy, soaring in testaments written not on bones, but on clay tablets, resting beneath monumental temples, built by the state, not by clans. Across the marsh grass plains of summer, communities shaped memory in brick, seal, and tower. Cities carved in clay and towering stone. The mud-dried platform of the Anu ziggurat in Uruk, by around 3200 before Common Era, marked a new horizon. The white temple that crowned it soared nearly 13 meters above the plain as a whitewashed sanctuary dedicated to the sky god Anu. From that height, temple fire danced over horizon lines, visible halfway across the city, in every light and season. In ancient texts, laborers recall stepping onto the podium as pilgrims to memory. We carried burdens towards sky, that shepherd of time might remember us. By circa 2100 before Common Era, the ziggurat of Ur, built by King Ordnamu and finished under Shulgi, rose in rising tiers of mud brick and fired brick, nearly 30 meters high, flanked by sweeping staircases and drained culverts, its purpose equal parts grain store and memory monument. Below, seals recorded yearly harvest, grain loans, and temple fees. These monumental constructions were not only temple architecture, they were statement machines, institutional memory forged in mud and pressed brick, instruments of record. From tokens to cuneiform around 3200 before Common Era, proto-cuneiform emerged in Uruk, morphing clay tablets into civic records. Sleek pictographs were pressed, not carved, not to tell legends, but to count rations, record herd numbers, or list temple labor days. Tokens of stone and clay, once meant to track sheep and grain in simple economies, were now replaced by clay tablets sealed with cylinder stamps, each signifying a household, a debt, or a crop parcel. The shift was seismic. Grain surpluses became stored memory, while cuneiform glyphs became legal text. Rumors, "You stole 2 vessels, pressed rice but wrote 3, became disputes in granary courts. Tokens could still be forged, but not the shape in clay before temple priesthood. Monumental audience, labor as ritual, building as Ordurto built a ziggurat took thousands of laborers, forced or voluntary. Procession routes extended from dockside warehouses through wrought portals toward elevations where daily offerings were staged. Men carved each mud brick, women carried baskets of baked dung, and children placed bits of kiln slag into temple pits. Even as grain fed the workers, gossip became a checkpoint. Anyone arriving late risked being shouted out by supervisors. Masks guarded temple gates, and forced presence in orchestrated chants. When she missed the labor line, our spring failed. City officials relied on rumor to enforce order. One chronicle mutters that the woman who stood outside the enclosure 5 times was banned from temple altars. This gossip masqueraded as religion, ritual as civic law. Memory sites and ritual chains inside the ziggurat precinct. Each temple boundary, every gate, causeway, or grain store was tied to a seal. These seals encoded identity. Clan A, Granary C, Souseed chosen 28 men. The seal, worn on clay, became a contract with memory. When someone defied temple contract, her vessel seal wore a mismatched spiraled mark. That vessel was impounded, not drowned in rumor, but buried beneath temple ash to symbolically erase supply lines. Funerary monuments within these precincts, burials beneath ziggurat substructures, used seal-lined jars and cuneiform tablets listing lineage, property, and temple dues. The mausoleum became memory archive. Problems and power plays. Temple versus household power shifted from household elder to temple steward. Religious authority could imprint a clay seal in seconds. One mistake spelled exile. Rumorous envy resurfaced. He baked a seal of tin stone under his wife's name. That gossip fractured public trust. Officials combed tombstone signs for seal imprints to identify sabotage. She did not return 2 jars. Her name is erased. Bronze and copper tools clinked behind granite-pillared threshold. Artisans sat beside priests. Yet rumor governed both. Her axe did not shimmer under temple load, so she paid with seed. Chapter 17. Legacies we still bear. Circa 8,000 before Common Era to present. Over the span of more than 10,000 years, from scattered farming bands through ziggurat servicemen to modern grids, human society has carried forward an inheritance etched in sheen. Seeds, stones, speech, and social codes. These are the unseen legacies narrated in everyday life. Agriculture, architecture, writing, ritual, surveillance, and scandal. Agriculture and permanent settlement. The shift from forage to farming defined all later human history. Crops like wheat, barley, oats, legumes, domesticated by circa 8,000 before Common Era, allowed population growth. Village formation and complex societies. Even today, 85% of people live off harvests of domesticated species. Land ownership systems still hinge on these early patterns. Seed lines defined history, economy, and identity. Architecture and memory structures from Jericho's stone tower, circa 8,300 before Common Era, to Ur-Ziggurat, circa 2,100 before Common Era. Humans have made architecture speak for identity and authority. Walls, masks, temples, towers, these built gestures remain in modern city squares, memorial pillars, and civic architecture as symbols of belonging, grievance, and ritual space. Proto-writing and contract culture. Clay tokens and proto-cuneiform, circa 3,200 before Common Era, gave birth to written accounting, replaced rumor with rulings, margin notes with messages. Our legal codes, bank statements, property deeds are direct descendants of seed tokens and temple documents. Written memory is civilization's skeleton. 4. Ritual performance and social control. Masker pageants, harvest dramas, skull feast rites, all guided behavior and enforced collective norms. Public ritual remains. Midwinter feasts, harvest festivals, masks in carnival. Ritual theater still suspends ordinary life and reinforces social order. Scapegoating, rumor as sanction. Ritual homage cost the guilty. Modern politics shadows these roots. 5. Rule. Gender division and labor. Scripts. The burden of grain work remained conditional. Women grinding, men plowing, specialists weaving, smithing. Social scripts born in Neolithic villages still shape modern gender roles. And artisanal allotments. 6. Power, surveillance, and data control. Early temple steward recorded each grain loan. Modern institutions record each financial transaction. Rivalry, once resolved by rumor, today resolved by watchdogs. Audits, algorithms. The earliest audits emerged from whispered accusation beside jar pits. Now they live in digital logs, but the structure is ancient. 7. When rumor becomes regime from the water well, whisper controlling access to the Ur-Ziggurat gate, through seed theft rumors in Neolithic stripes, to 21st century whistleblower subculture. Human power still runs on recorded doubt. Rumor continues to be written. In insider tips, gossip columns, leaky emails, permanent reputations. Context may change, but the logic remains. What cannot be proven is often policed by suspicion.